Hello and welcome to another OpenSim Creator video tutorial. I'm Adam, a software developer on the project. In this video, I'm going to be going over OpenSim Creator's Mesh Importer screen and using it to create a human hand. This is roughly based on tutorial 4 of the official OpenSim Creator documentation, which you can open by clicking here in OpenSim Creator and then clicking here. If you haven't seen tutorial 3 yet, which there's also a video available for, I'd strongly recommend it because the content of this video is going to assume you've already watched that and you're already familiar with using the OpenSim Mesh Importer, which is what's covered by this tutorial 3, where you made a double pendulum. Okay, so what are we doing today? Well, in this tutorial, we're going to be making a arm, or more specifically, we're going to just model one finger, and the rest of the arm's kind of an additional exercise, but I promise the steps involved with making the whole arm would just be a repeat of this one finger. Okay, and the way we're going to start on this is we need to download some mesh files. So in the documentation, you'll find that there's this meshes download button here. If you click that and save it somewhere, and then make sure it's unzipped somewhere. I'm going to unzip it on my desktop here. You just move that here. Yep, make sure all the meshes are exported. This tutorial is going to be working on these meshes to create this kind of hand model. So once you've got them unzipped on your desktop, open up OpenSim Creator and open up the Mesh Importer screen, which you can get to by either clicking Import Meshes here or clicking Import Meshes in the main menu. Both do the same thing. Once you have that open, the first step of the tutorial is to get these meshes into the Mesh Importer. So to do that, you can either drag and drop them from the Windows Explorer. So for example, you could do something like this, where you kind of drag it like that, and that will give you your hand mesh, your arm mesh rather. Alternatively, you can, let me just undo that. Alternatively, you can right click and click on Add Meshes, and then just browse to the meshes and make sure to select them all and click on Go, Open, and there you go. That will put all your arm mesh files into the Mesh Importer. So now that they're in here, the first thing I've done, actually, I've skipped ahead a little bit here, is that once they're imported, I've like kind of moved them above the ground. That's because the mesh files are kind of, the center of them is at the top of the arm here, and the whole kind of mesh altogether is below ground. So the first thing you need to do is move them up, which you can do with this green arrow over here. And if you accidentally deselected the meshes, you can select all with Control A, like that. And then you can move your entire selection around like this. Okay. With your meshes moved above the ground, the first step of this tutorial is to add bodies to these meshes. So there's a lot of meshes here, so we're not going to be adding bodies to every single mesh. There's going to be some simplifications. The first one I've already pointed out is that I'm just going to be assigning to one finger. But another one is that I'm probably just going to have one body for the wrist here, rather than trying to assign a body to each bone in the wrist. That would take a long time. And yeah, for the arm, I might just have one body in the middle of the arm, something like that, as another simplification. Okay. So yeah, we need to add bodies. So the way to add bodies to meshes is that you can right-click a mesh, and then you can go to Add Body. And you get a few options here, which can be handy in some situations. So you can, for example, add a body at the center of the mesh, which weirdly is going to put a body up here. But that's because this is the mesh center as far as a mesh file is concerned. Like this finger here was the center origin in space was here. That's why we had to move the whole thing up. It's a little bit confusing with this particular mesh, but it makes more sense if you have a mesh that's actually centered around 0 in the ground. But we're not going to do that. Another option is that, yeah, you can do add body, you can do add click position, which is where I right clicked, which I'll get to in a second. Well, we can give it a try. I mean, I right clicked kind of here, And that puts it where I right-clicked. You'll notice, though, that the body is massive compared to the mesh. That's because these bodies are sized kind of as if you're making something, I don't know, kind of human scale. Maybe you're doing like a leg or something like that, rather than like the bones in a hand. To get around these body meshes being too big, you can go up here to scene scale factor, and you can set this to a lower value. So if I set this to like 0.1, and what this does is it scales everything in the scene that doesn't have a real physical size. So a body has a physical size, and sorry, a mesh has a physical size in the sense of these are all the triangles in the mesh, so that doesn't get scaled by this. But a body is just a point in space, and we represent it with this cube. And changing this value here just makes it smaller and easier to move around. If it's too small, make the value bigger. If it's too big, make the value smaller, essentially. So just to get back to other placement options, so what we just did there was right-click and click, at click position. Another option is at bounds center, which is the center of the bounds of your mesh. So if you think about every point in your mesh, you can draw a cube around your mesh, and in the center of that cube is where this body will be added. That can sometimes be handy too, because the center of this mesh, again, is all the way at the top of the arm. So it's handy to know that you can do it this way. Other options for adding bodies. I'm sorry if I'm blabbing on. I know the tutorial just goes straight to adding bodies. I'm just trying to explore every option because adding bodies is a really important part of creating a model. So you may as well know every option. Another way of adding a body is instead of mousing over here, you can of course like mouse over the hierarchy and do the same thing. But the most common way that I add bodies is that I mouse over the body and I press B. And what this does is when you press B, it does pretty much exactly the same as right-clicking, going add body at click position. Right, so it's going to add a body at a click position. If I just undo this, you can see I'll make it a bit more obvious. B, B, B. You can see it's added 3 bodies at the click position where my mouse was when I pressed B. So just so you know, these are the ways of adding bodies into your scene. So for the first step of this tutorial, with that introduction out of the way, we're going to assign bodies all the way up this finger, up to the wrist, and then to the arm. And the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to mouse over and press B, mouse over and press B, and just keep doing that all the way up. And I put a wrist here. I'm going to put like the body on here, just for now. And then for the arm, I'll kind of put the body here, and then I'm going to alt-click just to select the body rather than the body and the mesh, right? So if you hold down Alt, click the body, or if you click the body down here in the hierarchy, it'll select just the body rather than everything attached to the body. I'm just going to move the body into the middle like this. All right, I've now got all the bodies kind of lined up, but they have default names. Like this is called body 9, it's called body 10 based on some defaulting rule. So the first thing I would do is kind of rename each body. So from the tutorial notes, what have we got here? We got, yeah, I guess it's a matter of whatever the body is attached to. So like this body is attached to this kind of mesh. So what I kind of did is I get the mesh name and I just put a B at the end to kind of indicate like, yeah, it's a body, not a mesh. So for each body, I'm right-clicking the mesh, right? Let me just finish this one off. I'm right-clicking the mesh and getting the mesh name, I'm copying it, and then I'm going to the body and I'm pasting it and just putting like an _B at the end. It's just a little kind of hacky shortcut for naming these bodies. I'm sure there's better naming conventions available. This kind of just gets the job done. So to here, I'm going to rename here. Right, and I'm just going to rename here. Okay, so for this body here, it's attached to this mesh, but I think I'm just going to call this arm underscore R underscore wrist body, so underscore B, so arm R wrist B for body. And the reason why is because although it's attached to this one mesh, I'm going to eventually be attaching all the meshes to this body. And it's the same deal with this one. I'm not going to call it arm R radius because both of these bones are going to be attached to this body. I'm just going to call this arm R for arm right arm, right? And B for body, right? That's all my bodies set up. So now what we have is we have some bodies that are attached to some of the meshes. These bodies have got kind of just default masses. They each weigh like a kilo. Obviously, if you're making a model, you're going to want to edit these, but you can edit them later in the OpenSim editor, so you don't have to edit them right now. But just be aware that everything does have a default mass. We can also reposition these bodies as another side note. So of course you can freely move them. You can change it from translate to rotate, and you can rotate them if you want. I'm not doing any of that right now, but if you wanted to make a more kind of accurate model, obviously you would do stuff like move these bodies into the correct location based on external measurements and so on. Yeah. Okay, so what's next? Right, so we've added our bodies. We've done that. I have the tutorial notes here, so I'm just scrolling through. Okay, so next step is we want to assign unassigned meshes to some bodies. So what I mean by this is that you'll notice that some of the meshes in the scene are red. And the reason they're red is because the graphics kind of backend is detecting that this mesh is attached to ground. Which typically in kind of an OpenSim model you don't want. You typically want your meshes to be attached to something kind of in your model, such as a body or joint frame or something like that. So it colors it red to kind of indicate to you that, yeah, you probably want to look into this and assign these meshes to something in your scene. So to do that, the way you do it, you can do this with assigned meshes or unassigned meshes. If you right click on a mesh, and you go to reassign connection, this is assigning what the mesh is attached to. So if I right click this mesh on the right here and I click arm B, you can now see that this is now assigned to the body arm underscore R underscore B. And if I reassign the connection again and I reassigned it back to ground, you can see that, okay, it's gone red again because it's attached to ground, which might not be what you want. All right, so I'm just going to undo that. Another way of reassigning connections is like, as always, you can right-click this menu over here, the hierarchy, and you can go reassign connection to reassign that thing. But again, there's always shortcuts available. So one such shortcut is that you can press A when you moused over a mesh to reassign that mesh, right? So if I mouse over this mesh, reassign that mesh, mouse over this mesh, reassign this mesh. And then the ultimate lazy way is that you can click on each mesh one at a time. This yellow circle that's popping up is just a helper. It doesn't pop up in the software. You see, I'm just going to attach. And what I'm doing here is I'm holding down Shift and I'm left clicking on each mesh. And once you've got everything selected, you can press A and then click what you want to assign it to. Right, so now you have all these meshes are assigned to these bodies. To this wrist body here, and if I click this, you can see that everything is selected as kind of one group. So okay, what's happening here? So like we have our bodies attached to the finger all the way up to the wrist. Everything else in the hand is attached to the wrist, and then everything in the arm is kind of attached to the central body here. And this is already a valid OpenSim model. Of course, it doesn't have any joints. And the way that the mesh importer works is that if there's no joint between a body and something else, then it will automatically create a weld joint between the body and ground, which again isn't necessarily what you want, but it at least produces a valid file where your body kind of floats in the air. It's the best it can do with the information it's got. So just as a quick example, and it's kind of trailing away from the tutorial for a second, if you were to convert this into an OpenSim model, you would have a valid OpenSim model that you could save. It just wouldn't have joints in the right location, right? And if I go back up here to File and back up to Import Meshes to get back to the Mesh Importer screen, the next step then clearly, I guess, is that we need to start adding joints into the model, right? Because although we have the bodies set up, the joints are kind of what determines how these finger bones kind of move with respect to each other. So the next step of this model building is to start adding joints. And the way to do that is that you can right click on a body and then go join to, click that. And now you're going to select what the joint goes to. So I want a joint from this body to this body. And I click that, it's going to add a joint center like this, right? And you can see here on the left-hand side in the hierarchy view, you now have this weld joint that's just been added, and you can see it highlighted as being selected. This is the joint you've just created. And if you want to quickly experiment to make sure you're happy with it, you can right-click on the joint. You could change it, for example, to a pin joint, right? And then if you convert that to an OpenSim model, it looks the same, but you now have this like extra joint center here, right? So which you can rotate along. So now you can kind of rotate just that one piece of the finger, so you kind of know you're going down the right track. And that's what we're going to be doing for the rest of the model, right? So this is section 4.5 of the tutorial, but effectively what we're going to do is we're going to create joints between each of these bodies at the finger joint location. And again, it's kind of repetitive, but what you do is you kind of right click, join to this thing, deal with your joint. I'll do that separately in a second. You can right click, do the same again. But as with adding bodies, there's a shortcut here. If you press J while you're moused over a body, it will automatically just open the join to kind of menu, and then you just select where you want to join to. So you can mouse over a body, J here, right? And then we probably want something like here, join to here, right? So I've added the joints now, and what's happened is that the joints have automatically ended up at the midpoint between the two bodies. So they might superficially look like they're in the right place, but clearly we need to do some kind of placement on these. But we now have a few joints in our model. And the next stage, I guess, is to kind of name each of them. So what naming convention have I used? Let me just have a look at the tutorial notes here. Yeah, you can. What I generally do is I name it the body it's attaching from and the body it's attaching to with like a 2 in between it or something like that. So in this case, it's kind of what is it? It's this body to dist path to mid pH or something like that, right? And then for this body, again, I'd normally just copy some text here, override the default name with like 2 prox pH. Right. A little bit tedious this. Unfortunately, there's no magic shortcut for renaming just yet, although I would really love one. And if I just go here, 2 prox pH to MC, right? And we've got this joint center here, kind of it went inside the wrist. If you ever have stuff like this where you have a scene element has ended up inside a mesh or inside another scene element, you can always change the visibility of colors up here. So I could, for example, make the meshes kind of like semi-transparent, which makes them a little bit easier to work with. And then I could make the meshes not interactable. And now I can just mouse over this joint center and play with it. So what I want to do is call it something. So again, I'm going to copy this body name, paste it in to wrist. And then there's one pin joint here, which is wrist to arm. So again, just copy this name, wrist to arm. Okay. And another thing that was done that's in a tutorial, and it's just good practice, is to add a joint between this top body here and the ground as kind of a free joint, or I'm going to add it as a weld joint initially. But the advantage of adding a joint between this body and ground is that you can later change it into something like a free joint so that you can move a whole mesh around in space from the coordinates panel. It's a convention people sometimes use when they're making OpenSim models. And to do that, again, right-click join to, or you can press J, and then you can mouse over ground to create this thing here. I'll just leave it over on the side for a second, which I'm going to call arm R to ground. Okay, so we've added all our pin joints. We've added all our joints, rather. and we've named them. Next thing we need to do is to make sure we're all the right type of joint. For this tutorial, I'm making things kind of simple, and I'm just going to stick with pin joints for now. You can change your joint type later down the line. You can change it in the OpenSim editor. So if you export your file as export your scene here, and it contains a bunch of weld joints, and you later decide you want it to be a pin joint, that can be changed later down the line. You're not pinned into using a particular type of joint. But for this particular tutorial, what I'm going to do is go to each joint and just change each one to a pin joint. Right, so got that there. We've got this here. What else do we have? I guess we have wrist. And what I'm going to do for the joint between the arm and ground, I'm going to make that a weld joint. I'm going to leave that rather as a weld joint, so that the whole arm is kind of anchored in space, right? And these things can really flop around on the pin joints. You'll see what I mean in a second. Or in fact, you know, it doesn't take long, I guess. I'll show you what I mean right now. So if I convert this to a model, I now have my arm, but it has a load of joint centers, which aren't placed very well yet. But you can see that each joint center kind of gives a little bit of rotation. Like, okay, that's somewhere near the top of the finger. That's somewhere near the bottom of the finger. Yeah, okay. This is the whole wrist, for example. And if I simulate this, you can see that, okay, it's wobbling along, and the finger's wobbling along here. And the next step of this process, which I think in the tutorial is maybe the later part of section 4.5, is that we need to start placing these joints and start putting them in more sane locations. So if we go back into Mesh Importer again, by going to File menu and clicking on Import Meshes, we need to start placing these. Now, these joint centers can be pretty tricky to place accurately. So I've got a few tricks. One is, when you're doing fine work like this, turn your scene scale factor down even more, so that you can start placing these things at a kind of very, very fine location. And in order to place a joint center, a pin joint center like this on this bone mesh, one thing you can do is you can translate to a particular location between two mesh points. In this alpha version of OpenSim Creator, this is a little bit janky, but the way that it works is that if you left-click somewhere, and then you right... Okay, well, if you left-click somewhere, it doesn't seem to work, probably because I've ticked here, which would be kind of funny. That's actually a bug. So yes, again, it's an alpha version of the software, so it's a bit janky. So if you turn on interactivity, if you had it turned off, make sure to turn it on again. You can then start to click on the meshes, and the way that placing between two mesh points works is that you can left click somewhere for your first point, and then you can kind of right click somewhere for your second point, and that'll place that pin joint kind of between those two mesh points, right? So now you've got a joint that's right in the middle here. Another little cool trip, if you find that your camera is getting a bit screwy when you're really zoomed in like this, you can right click and focus the camera on the thing you're working on like this, and then you get like much better camera positioning around there. So as you can see now, I've positioned my camera and I'm looking around, it's like, okay, you know, this position isn't great right now. So you can then say, okay, like I want actually, you know, maybe this is a better location for it. And again, I can focus on it and have a look, and yeah, I'm much happier with this location, right? And then when it comes to getting the angle right, it depends on your convention, but there's also, if you right click on a joint center, you got these reorient options, and you could, for example, say reorient X like towards the parent. So make sure this X axis is pointing towards this parent body over here. The location doesn't change, so now that we've placed it, it's kind of sat there. And now we've got it placed in the right thing, the right location. X is pointing in the right direction. If we now click on the joint center and we switch to rotate, right, either by going here and clicking rotate or pressing the R key, right, we'll do that. You got G for grab or move, R for rotate, and S for scale. If you press R and then you make it local, either by pressing R again. If I keep pressing R, it switches between these two modes, or you can go up here and click local. you can now perform local rotations along the x-axis. So if the x-axis is pointed in the right direction, it's in the right location. And now I'm just trying to figure out, okay, what should the pin joint kind of angle be? Like maybe this, right? This is a little bit, it depends on how you do these things. I'm just saying if you want to try to eyeball this and you don't have any kind of Python script for doing it, this is one way of doing it. So for each of these pin joints, I'm going to do the same thing, but I'm going to do it a little bit faster now that I've demonstrated it once. So I'm going to focus the camera on this, and then I'm going to like right-click this, translate it between two mesh points, and I'm going to say like I would like it to be between here and here. And I want the X to point towards parent. I want to do this. I do a little local rotation, figure out is the angle okay? Yeah, it looks okay. One problem here, come to think of it, is that my bodies aren't particularly well placed. So I guess I can alt click this body, press G to grab it, or go over here to translate. Yeah, do a global translation. And yeah, maybe I want the bodies because where I clicked, maybe I want the bodies kind of deeper in the bone. That might help with my axis location. These are the types of little edits you'll probably want to do as a model builder when you're first setting this up, and that's completely natural. You just have to get into it. This is why we have keybinds, and yeah, you have to kind of get familiar with some of the tricks. So I'm going to translate this. If I place that body better? No, I've got to place this body. So okay, and the more time you spend placing these things, the better the quality of your kind of model will end up being usually, because yeah, you can get really nice locations on things, and it really helps. So I'm just going to go through and do the rest here. I might put an edit in to yeah, to speed this up. Otherwise, you're going to be bored silly watching me do every single joint location. Go here. And again, disable interactivity of the meshes. Click this. Okay, translate. Okay, yeah, and then we need to place this. I'm sorry if this is dragging on and I haven't had a chance to edit this footage out. Please bear with me. I'm just placing these joint centers as best as I can. So again, focus the camera on this thing. Translate between two mesh points. Oh my god, there's a lot going on here. Maybe here to here. Yeah, isn't great. Holding down Alt to select this body, making sure the body is kind of closer to the center of the wrist, like that. Make sure this is pointed towards that body. Oh god, this is a really nasty angle here. So again, doing a local rotation. And it might just be that I have to reorient the X a little bit on this one because, yeah, that wrist location isn't helping me too much. Maybe I need something like this. And then I probably need to, yeah, this joint center probably needs a bit of work, if I'm guessing. And we've got the wrist to do, which is this one up here. Pressing G, I'm going to put it into position. And I'm going to eyeball this one. Okay, yeah, that should do. And then when it comes to this weld joint here, I'm just going to translate that to the location of the child. Whoops, I pressed parent now. Let me just undo that. Translate that to the location of a child, which is just inside this arm body. It's fine there. The joint isn't really doing anything active. It's just a weld joint right now. And now, yeah, so now I have model. I placed my joints. I'm fairly happy with the locations, and the next thing is to give it a little try. So if you move it into OpenSim, convert it into an OpenSim model, and you kind of twiddle with the joint coordinates, you can kind of see what they're doing. So yeah, if you look here, see, oh, okay, that's like the finger one. That looks okay. That looks a little bit off. That one. This one's a little bit. This one seems okay. This one seems okay. And then you got the whole hand. And then if I simulate this whole hand, you can see that okay, yeah, like the fingers are a bit crazy because they're like the body masses are like a kilo, so actually these are like tiny 1 kilo weights attached. So the whole hand's going a bit haywire right now because the weights are a bit off, but for the most part, it seems okay. Clear, there's no limits on how much a bone can spin around. So you'll see that this bone has spun like 360, 180 degrees around the pin joint and ended up in this crazy location. But in terms of topology and in terms of having the joints in there and having a valid model, it's fine. It's just it needs some coordinate limiters. One thing you might notice is you'll see these frames flying around, right? Like if I look at these, you'll see all these frames flying around, and you might be wondering, like, what on earth are these? These are the frames of your mesh files. So the mesh origin, again, is all the way up here at the top of the arm. And whenever this body rotates, it has to make sure that the mesh rotates correctly, like, relative to the body, and that means moving the mesh's origin to these like very crazy looking like kind of locations. You can go up to edit here and hide frames, just to hide the frame, so at least it's not quite as jarring to see this thing moving forward like this. And yeah, hopefully that helps. So yeah. Anyway, moving on. We have a hand, right? It has some joints. All the meshes are kind of attached up. The bodies are in roughly the right place. What's next? Well, this might be enough for you already, right? Because it might be that the hardest part of your model building journey is just setting up that initial topology of bodies and joints. And you might now want to do things like save it. For example, let me just show you what I mean. If I go desktop and I save like arm without muscles, right? You might want to just look at it in the official OpenSim GUI. So if I open it up, you might just want to start working on it with other tooling. And at this point in the process, now that you're kind of done with the mesh importing, maybe this is a point where you want to move away from OpenSim Creator and start making external edits, right? So that's one thing you might want to try. You may want to make edits to the underlying OpenSim file, and yeah, but one cool feature of OpenSim Creator is that it does hot reloading on the actual file. So one thing you can do is you go to edit up here, and you open it in an external editor, right? This is the underlying OSIM file, and if you're somebody who's familiar with OpenSim, you know that you can probably go in here and kind of mess with some of the numbers in order to get things to happen like in the editor. So you can see here that by changing a scale factor in this OSIM editor in Sublime Text, it's automatically reloaded the OSIM file and applied that change without you having to reload the file manually. And the beauty of that is that, yeah, you can now start working in kind of pure OpenSim mode if you want to. But we're not going to do that for the rest of this tutorial. I'm just pointing it out as something you can do if you feel like you've already done what you need to do. So yeah, with that aside out the way, I guess the next thing we're going to do is move on to what section 4.6 in the tutorial, which is to start marking points of interest on the meshes. So I'm going to go up to File, Import Meshes to go back to the Mesh Import screen. So the next thing we're going to do, I'm also going to turn up the color here just to make this white, is we've got our bodies, we've got our meshes, we've got our joints, and we're going to start marking points on these meshes that we're going to call points of interest or stations in OpenSim Creator terms, which are locations kind of in your scene that are interesting in some way. And for us, the things that are interesting are the location of muscle insertion points and origin points, right? So it might be that we want to say, okay, like I'm going to mark points on this mesh that like I know are roughly where my muscle paths are going to be later down the line. And the advantage of doing this in the mesh importer is that you're still in this kind of freeform mode where you can move things around freely and undo, redo, and all that kind of stuff, kind of independently of OpenSim. And you can also do that with these points of interest, and that might be handy because what it gives you is it gives you all these points with respect to the bodies, and you can use those points later to create muscles. So I'll show you what I mean. So just going through kind of section 4.6 here, we're going to start adding stations to model, right? And I'm going to do this at a slightly lower scene scale factor. If you click up here, I'm changing it to 0.05 to make everything a bit smaller. What I'm going to do is I'm going to mark places on this mesh that I think are going to be used for muscle paths later. And the way that I can do that is I can right click on the mesh, I can go add, station, and I have a few options here, same as adding a body to a mesh. So center would go to the mesh origin, which isn't very useful here. Click location is where my mouse was, that might be useful. At ground, not very useful right now. Bound center, which is the center of this mesh, which it also isn't particularly useful right now. For most users of a station, you're probably going to want at click position. So what I've done is I've right clicked somewhere, right? And I said station at click position, and it adds a station right there. And you could, and much like adding bodies and joints has a hotkey, adding stations has a hotkey. If you press T, it does the same thing, right? So if I press T, it's going to add a load of stations, and then maybe I'm using a funny keyboard here, so I don't have access to to a delete key, amazingly. But if I just undo these, that's how that works. So what I'm going to be doing here is I'm going to be pressing T where I think I want to put muscles, right? So I'm going to go like T to here, and that's added a station within this body frame. If you're ever wondering what frame the station is expressed in, you can see that if you mouse over it, it says station attached to, when it has like the body that it's attached to, and it has this little line to indicate that's what it's currently attached to. The relevance of that is that it means the coordinates of the station are expressed within that frame. If you want to know the coordinates of this location in space within some other frame, actually, again, as another side note, you can always reassign the station to be connected to, like, for example, ground, and now the coordinates are expressed in ground. I'm going to undo that. So yeah, back to adding stations. I just thought people would find it interesting. I'm going to mouse over each place where I think a muscle origin and insertion spot is. So I'm saying like this one is the insertion, right? And this one's like the origin, and this one's going to be like an insertion, and this one's going to be like an origin. And same deal here. And yeah, I'm just going to go through my whole kind of list of stuff. And maybe I want a muscle like here. And I'm going to stop for, because you can probably guess what's going to happen here. Now, yeah, these positions might not be what you actually want in terms of muscle points. It may also not be enough muscle points, but there's no limit on how many stations you add. You can, for example, I can knock down the scene scale factor a bit more to make things even smaller, because I'm trying to do even more fine detailed stuff. And I could, for example, be like, okay, like, you know, my muscle path is going to like go like this over this bone mesh, and there's no limit to how many of these stations you can add, and you can have a path over many stations if you want. But just purely for the sake of this particular tutorial, I've limited it to just kind of one insertion and one origin point per muscle. But just so you know, you can have multiple points in a path. Again, I'm going off track here, but there's a lot to cover, and I feel like mentioning it now is handy, so that when we start making muscles, it kind of seems to make a bit more sense. So what I've done here is, yeah, I've added these stations, which I'm saying are points of interest in my model. I'm going to label them up because later down the line, I'm going to want to be able to identify them by name. So it might just be, I can come up with my own naming convention, but the convention I used in the tutorial notes was to use like the body name followed by like insertion, which you know, does the job. So I basically right click to mesh, copied that name, click on the station, click ins for insertion, right? And then right click the mesh, take a name, origin. And I'm just going to repeat this over and over again. It's a little bit mundane, I know, but let me just go through insertion, right here. I'm going to label this RH. And it might be that if you have more complicated paths, you're going to have like, you know, this station, insertion 1, insertion 2, insertion 3, insertion 4, insertion A, B, C, D, E, F, whatever you're going to use to like identify each point in the path you're eventually going to create. But yeah, any name convention is fine. These are just points of interest that you're going to use later down the line. So insertion, right? I'm going to go here. I'm going to go like origin, right? I'm going to go up here. This one's an insertion side. And then up here, this is actually the wrist, right? So wrist, ridge, maybe something like that. Okay, so I've marked out my points. I've gave them names. The other thing to keep in mind is that because we're in a mesh importer, you can of course like freely move these things in space. If you want to make minor adjustments, it doesn't have to be where you click. It can just be, you know, that's how you set it initially, but you can then move it. So I could, for example, focus my camera on it, right? So I can get some more accurate kind of camera positioning, and then I can kind of like slide it into the location I really want it to be in to do some fine adjustments like that. With everything marked up, if I now convert this to an OpenSim model, nothing much has changed about the model, right? You still have the same number of joints, same number of bodies, but maybe I'll have to scale up the scene here by clicking on Edit in the top left and then changing my scene scale factor to, let's say, 0.1. You can see that although my body is the same, it now contains, my model rather, is the same in OpenSim. It now contains these OpenSim stations, like kind of in the model, right? And again, the value of this is that if you then were to save this file, let's just put it in here, right? And then you opened it in an external editor. If you then looked at these stations, you could actually see station elements in your file. And these are all expressed within a particular frame. So you can get kind of frame-based coordinates out of this process already, and then you can delete the station afterwards. But one handy feature is that you can also use the stations when adding muscles in OpenSim Creator. So if I now go over here to add /muscle, right, and I go to the load equilibrium muscle, I can go like, okay, ints for, what are we going to do? I guess we want 2 dist pH insertion to 2 mid pH origin, right? So 2 dist pH insertion to 2 dist pH to mid pH origin. This is probably the more confusing part of the UX design right now. Again, it's alpha software, so I can't make any guarantees about UX. But if you add those 2 points to a new muscle path, you can see that, like, oh, right, you know, you have a muscle between these 2 finger bones, which is, yeah, nice. And that gives you kind of a starting point for building up a muscle and building up kind of a more complicated model. So, I mean, I'm going to go through each of these kind of points here just to kind of demonstrate that, yeah, this is all possible. So like mid pH to prox pH. So again, mid pH insertion, right, to prox pH origin. Oh, yes, this one. Okay, I probably double named something when I was in a mesh importer there, but that's fine. Again, these stations are just points of interest. We're not doing anything functional inside the model. And then, yeah, I'm probably going to speed up the footage here, but basically, I'm just going to keep repeating the process. So, prox pH ints, prox pH origin. So, and then this one's one of a typo. It's probably that one. Okay, and now we got another one here. We got arm to MC ints to wrist origin. Okay. To wrist origin. Okay. Okay, so right, these aren't the best muscle paths you've ever seen. They're not like physiologically accurate, but you can hopefully see that if I was to have lots and lots of points on this mesh, and I carefully added each point through this dialog box, I could actually set up a pretty convincing looking kind of finger model, right? I could have muscles spanning the bodies. I could have my joints set up, and now hopefully you feel like this is a good start to a model, and that you can work from this kind of starting point. So the next steps here then, again, I'm looking through the tutorial, is that, yeah, we've set up a model. It's obviously very basic, but you can see how you could probably expand this technique to the rest of the hand. And again, you can always open this file in the OpenSim editor and start adding extra path points and start moving the path points around. I mean, I'll quickly demonstrate that for you if it's helpful. So if I save it and I go to an external editor, because maybe there's something in OpenSim Creator that you can't edit. Maybe I click here and there's like a property that can't be edited. I could, for example, go to here and say, okay, like I want to work on this muscle here, which is called Millard equilibrium muscle _1. So if I then go into this file here and I go like Millard I've completely screwed this up by forgetting the 2012. So this muscle here is the muscle I'm looking at, and if I then wanted to, for example, change like a location of a path point, I could go in here and then I could save a file, and you can see that like, oh, okay, like I'm getting like these minor adjustments, and hopefully that's an easier workflow than having to kind of edit a file and manually reload the file and then mess around with like that. You can get instant feedback as you edit and add more complicated features to your model, even if the UI doesn't support it yet. And once you're happy with your model, of course, you can do a basic simulation in OpenSim Creator, and you can do some basic kind of data plotting. You could, for example, right-click the muscle and request, I don't know, like a tendon force on the muscle, and then you can switch and you can see that, oh, this is like 0 tendon force for some reason. But you can, in principle, like go through everything in your model and yeah, plot outputs and so on. Okay, so yeah, that's been this tutorial. So we've essentially used the mesh importer to create kind of a finger of a hand. Hopefully you can see that like the same process would just apply for the rest of the fingers, but it would take a very long time to do this in tutorial format. And yeah, I'm looking forward to seeing what people can do with these types of techniques, and I look forward to seeing you guys in the next tutorial.